Hello, everyone. My name is Professor Mirjana Pantic. This is MCA 115 News Reporting. Today's lecture is about feature writing. So far, we have covered formats such as the inverted pyramid and then other types of writing, such as hourglass, narrative style, and so on. And today, we're going to look into a creative form of writing in journalism, which is called feature writing. What is feature? What it means to create a feature story. So feature stories may appear everywhere, online or in documentaries, magazines, newspapers, radio, and television. Feature stories are also called human interest stories because they say something about life. So they go beyond daily events and they tell us a more comprehensive stories about diverse people, issues, historical events, and so on. What are some examples of feature stories? So we can write a feature story about and extreme sports, for instance, that people engage in. Like, why would it be interesting for us? Because people like to learn about things they might not necessarily participate in, but they want to know why is it that other people care about them, or they want to learn about the unknown. So, for instance, if there is, let's say, I know a lot of people like watching horse races, and I don't really understand it because I'm not interested. But if somebody wrote an interesting feature story about those people who like it, who enjoy watching horse races, I would certainly be interested and intrigued to learn more about it, to see what makes a horse race interesting to them. Or you can write about a hobby, an unusual hobby, or it could be a regular hobby that people engage in or a group of people engages in. So the thing with feature stories is that you don't need to write them right away when it comes to inverted pyramid or hard news stories. So as soon as an event happens, you're expected to write a report about it. But when it comes to feature stories, it doesn't really need to be written right away. You can write a feature story your for a weekly edition of your magazine or newspaper, so you don't need to report on things instantly. Everything in feature stories is factual, not made up. This is really important because when you open newspapers or when you see a feature story in documentaries or you hear it on a radio, you will detect a writing style that will remind you of fiction writing. There's a lot of description. They tend to describe the setting in feature stories. So journalists like to explain what is it they saw, to describe emotions of people and so on. So it's not something that we see in hard news stories where journalists usually just report on straightforward facts. So this is definitely different. You will find more descriptive elements. But remember, unlike fiction, where we make things up, in feature stories, everything needs to be factual. The most crucial step in writing a good feature story is making the topic fresh, dramatic, colorful, and exciting. Let's say you want to write a feature story about how people occupy um, superstores and um, department stores for Black Friday. So you're not going to write that story in May. You're going to wait for the Thanksgiving week to talk to people or to actually go and write a feature about how they prepare for Black Friday shopping, how do they shop, where do they camp, and so on. So it's basically really um, it has to be fresh. So regardless of the fact that you don't need to publish it today, you can publish it maybe in 2 days when you collect all interesting information for your story. It still has to be fresh. It should be related to some issue that is interesting to us. But we can also write about places, interesting places, and the story doesn't need to be timely, but maybe want to introduce like a city that has an interesting industry that would prompt our readers to visit it or to just, like learn something new about the place that they're not really familiar with. So, add dramatic, colorful details, make it exciting, and so on. Let's take a look at some major characteristics of feature writing, feature stories. They require a central theme, but are longer than news stories. So in one of the slides, I mentioned refugees. I didn't go into details on it, but let's say if you're writing about the crisis in the Middle East, and we want to focus on a specific element. So our central theme are refugees fleeing from there to other countries, European countries, or to the United States. We want to select groups of people or families and talk to them, portray their struggles, use their quotes in our feature stories to explain the problems they're dealing with, what they're expecting, where they're going, what are their hopes, what is it that they're running away from, how are they fleeing their country, and so on. So in those feature stories, you focus on a central theme and then you build your story around it. But there has to be some fresh element added to the feature story, like a specific event, specific social problem that you want to portray this way. Features provide definitely more details than news stories, and they're more relaxed, more descriptive than the news. And one of the things related to feature stories is that they have an entertaining style, of course, depending on what kind of topic they are covering. Because if we talk about extreme sports or hobbies, of course, or celebrities, of course, that is likely to have an entertaining style. But if we talk about some serious issues, such as we can feature people who are struggling through poverty. We can portray refugees again, and or write immigrant stories, immigrant feature stories. That is not going to be entertaining. So it really depends on the topic, but many of them do have that entertaining style. But all these stories are still going to be descriptive and they're going to be different from the inverted pyramid stories where we're expected to be concise, not to go into depth of emotions, not to go into depth of descriptions. So, if I'm going to write a feature that portrays how different politicians organize press conferences, then I'm going to definitely look into the setting and describe it, and how does the room where they hold press conferences look like, and so on. I will describe the people in that place who are likely to come, the number, and so on. But if I just go as a journalist to report from a press conference, I don't care about the room. The only thing I care about is what the person is going to say. So there's a lot of different elements that we are looking into when it comes to feature writing. We need to have that keen eye for details that can contribute to our story. It can make it more interesting and more engaging. So we're adding details that are not a necessity for those hard news stories, inverted pyramid stories. Features must include actions, people, and places. We can write about activities, or we can have profile features, like features describing an individual or a celebrity, or we can simply portray places in feature stories. So I was looking online to find something interesting because it is important always to have some examples. And especially in this case, I wanted to provide an example of how feature story looks different in comparison to an inverted pyramid story. Remember, in case of inverted pyramid stories, you basically just organized information based on its relevance. But in feature stories, it's different. It's kind of, you try to create an engaging paragraph, a hook where you can start with an anecdote or an interesting example. You just want to make sure, just like with fiction writing, you want to make sure that people get immersed as they read your first paragraph, that they really want to see what's going on and they really want to learn more, because feature stories are long. They run on several pages in magazines. Sometimes it takes 15 minutes to read them. So you really want to be interesting from the beginning. And even though you add so many details into your story, it's still every paragraph needs to be engaging. So you're going to combine description with dialogues, with quotes to make the feature dynamic. So I found this story about Pilates. I thought it was interesting. It's a feature story published on the Guardian website in January. The best abs I've ever had, but it hurt. The punishing rise of extreme Pilates. So from the title, from the headline, you can see what the story is about. It is about Pilates. And now you want to read this journalist's perspective on Pilates. So let's see how she started this story. It's lunchtime on a Wednesday, and I'm in a dark room shaking intensely. So it's already has this element of intensity, and she even uses that word in the first sentence. So she wants you to get into this story and to read it, to read about her experience and how she portrayed Pilates. Then she goes on. My forearms are propped up on a big black machine called Svetlana. This was interesting to me because Svetlana is actually a common Eastern European uh, female name. So when I read it, it was funny to me as it's a common name in Serbia. So Svetlana, you understand from the word what it refers to at at the gym setting. Like five other quaking women beside me, I'm furiously plank crunching, attempting to move the machine's carriage forwards and backwards using only the force of my abs. Come on, team, bellows a high energy instructor over the booming music, urging us all to get comfortable with discomfort. Our trembles, she says, are a sign of reaching second stage muscle failure, which is not, as it sounds, fatal, but apparently a state to aspire to if we want to get stronger. Welcome to Solid Core, a 50-minute workout which combines and so on. So basically, from the third paragraph, you can see what she is referring to. This is like a specific Pilates workout that she's talking about, the extreme Pilates. And then she explains like who are the people who are also interested in, like celebrity fans and so on. So she describes how classes take place in dark blue lit studios and so on. So it's kind of with all these descriptions, she gets you into the studio and you really feel like you're watching them working out. If it was a hard news story, it would look completely different. We would need something interesting would need to happen for us to report about it, like a sudden increase in um, workout fans who are particularly interested in this form of exercise, in extreme Pilates. And then, if we had any statistics to report on it, then we would like write not a hard news story, but more like a soft news story in the inverted pyramid style, explaining like how there's increase, and potentially we would talk about an instructor or a person who goes and takes these classes and so on, and create a story. But in this case, everything is different. It's about the setting, it's about the people who go there, the instructor, how the classes look like, and so on. So you can read the full story on the Guardian website. I think it's really interesting. There are other examples as well. So this one is an old example, but I always find it very I always kind of want to include it in my lectures about feature storytelling because it's an excellent example how to create a heartbreaking, but also a very descriptive story about Somalis at the time when they were struggling with cholera, and that was in 2017. So this feature was published in Washington Post, and I want you to look at the feature and see how it explained the cholera crisis by starting telling a story about the man who was digging graves for children. So you see, in this story, they started with a specific example, and this example is so heartbreaking. It really depicts how horrible this disease is, and it really portrays all the tragedy that the communities in Somalis were dealing with in 2017. So they started with this example, and this tiny example served to introduce a much bigger issue. So you see, and you will see based on this description, how different this type of writing is for concise, simple, straight to the point writing that we use when we report on breaking news. This story portrays how dramatic the situation was at the time. So let's just read a few paragraphs and you see how they actually introduce the problem through this example. After Noor stepped back from the tiny graves he'd been digging and surveyed his work, exhausted, he turned his palm skyward, squinting into the relentless midday sun, and asked God for an answer. I dug 3 children's grave this morning, said Noor, his voice cracking, his undershirt soaked in sweat. And I have dug 20 or more this month. Why? So in this quote, you can see that this man is hurting because he doesn't understand how is it possible that all these children are dying from cholera. Again, this was from 2017. And also something unusual that you see, and we will see in feature stories, but you will not see in hard news stories, is that the journalist also described the man in this story and how he was uh, completely defeated by all the pain he was carrying while digging the grave, how he was soaked with sweat because he had to dig so many graves, and so on. The immediate answer, and now you see like the first 2 paragraphs, we're still not sure what this is about, even though you can see from the headline, but it's the third paragraph that introduces the problem. So we're hooked by the example because it's heartbreaking. It is devastating to read about these children. And then the third paragraph is where the problem is being introduced. So what is it? The immediate answer is cholera, the waterborne bacterial disease sweeping through the city's sprawling refugee camps, which are filled with people driven from their villages by a vicious drought, and so on. So you see the description continues, and this is basically how they put together a feature story that, again, is very upsetting to read, but also extremely well written. At this point, I just want to announce an exercise that I have for you that you need to complete before class. So it has already been posted in the discussion. Go and search it under week 9. You will find the exercise where you will need to read a feature story and then answer a couple of questions related to that feature story. So the exercise before class has been posted, and you can open it and complete it before, and you should complete it before class. What are major parts of feature stories? The lead, so the first paragraph, the lead of the story should be interesting. So The lead should not answer 5W plus H that needs to answer that the lead in the inverted pyramid story needs to answer. In this case, the lead just needs to be interesting, engaging. So use an anecdote, ask a question, provide an interesting example, whatever you can think of to hook people into reading your story. Write it in a way that will make people want to stay because you're writing this long story, so they want to be intrigued by the topic that you're introducing and the way you're introducing that topic in order to read your story. The body of a feature story takes many forms. It can be in the inverted pyramid style, so you can organize it. It's going to be, the style is going to be a little different because it will include all these descriptions and more quotes and so on. But then on the other side, it may take a form of the inverted pyramid as you will decide to organize it based on what you feel is the most important. You will also have, let's say for a feature story, you might have several interviewees, and you might decide, even though maybe one of your interviewees is more, how would I say, more prominent than the other, but what if the other interviewee is more interesting, that you might consider placing that interviewee's quote before the other interviewee's quote if you feel that they would make reader keep reading your story. So this is something that you will figure out as you work on your piece. The inverted pyramid style may be appropriate for some features, while for some other features, maybe chronological order could be better. The end of a feature story should have a satisfying conclusion. It doesn't mean that you should say at the end, oh, this is what I mean about the story, but just to have like a concluding remark. It can be a quote from a person. So a person you interviewed for your feature story could have an interesting like statement that you can use for the end of your story and simply conclude your story with that. So as you can see, in this case, it's not about, like in the inverted pyramid, I'm just going to end with the least important information. You need to end it even with something interesting. It can also be an anecdote or a phrase repeated in some surprising but meaningful way. So what journalists avoid ending a feature story with is summary. What are the most important things to know when writing feature stories? How to write good features. For example, instead of saying that a person is funny, give specific examples of the subject's humor. How do you do that? You can quote them. You can quote the joke that they made, or you can describe something funny that they did. So just include that inscription. Don't say he's a funny man. No, like you can say he's a funny man and then like provide an example of their humor. Be descriptive, emphasize lively details. Like when we in the example of the cholera story, you were able to see how they described the man sweating and basically being tired and heartbroken and asking himself, like, how is it possible that all these children are dying? Provide an occasional change of pace, make that shift to make the story engaging, just like you would do if you were to write a fiction story. Now, there is another example, as I mentioned, some of the things that people do, they write about places, they write about interesting individuals, they also write about hobbies. One of the stories that I found also in The Guardian was about pottering. It's not that I'm actually, for instance, I'm not interested in that. I wouldn't be interested in making any of these things or taking classes, but I was intrigued by this place and what people do. So I wanted to actually, that's one of the reasons why people read feature stories. Like I actually wanted to learn more about it. I wanted to learn about this place called Stoke-on-Trent that is it is in England, and it is known by its pottery industry. So I really wanted to learn more, and I just stumbled upon this feature story when I was searching for examples. I just stumbled upon this feature story and thought, like, oh, I'm not interested in doing this, but I'm interested in learning how this process looks like and why people are so intrigued by it. So here's the story. You can read more in The Guardian. I'll just read like the first paragraph so you can see what kind of elements the journalist decided to use to make the story interesting. As a lump of dumb clay spins frantically on the potter's wheel, I tentatively ease my fingers around it, hoping it will so soon resemble a pot. So, from this first sentence, I was able to see how the journalist really was intrigued by the process of making a pot and hoping that what he was doing at the moment would result in a pot creation. Thankfully, there are two instructors leading the six of us on this hour-long tester season session to offer guidance and, in my case, rescue a collapsing pile of clay. So apparently he went there to test it, and he wasn't like certain that he would be able to make it in the end. So he was relying on the help of these two instructors. I glanced at the others' creations, elegant faces in bowl, and then at mine, which looks more like a volcano. Still, I'm impressed with myself for creating something resembling pottery, and it's been fun to get stuck in, and so on. And then the journalist goes into more details about the place where he was trying to make this creation. So what from these examples, what is it that we learned about feature stories and what kind of feature stories we can encounter? Um, so there are profiles or personality features. They aim at describing interesting people. They also aim at describing celebrities as well. So if you're doing a profile or personality feature, it is likely that you're going to go to their house, their apartment, because you're not only gonna, for feature or personality features, you're not only gonna write about their uh, personality, their hobby, their in the industry that they work in, that they represent, but you're also gonna try to describe their home, activities they engage in, and so on. So all these other details that we are not able to see daily. Historical features, they're usually used to describe historical events such as 4th of July or 9/11, the Boston Tea Party. Adventure features describe unusual and exciting experience that people engage in. There are also seasonal features, and these features are about seasons or holidays such as Christmas. Explanatory features are those where journalists provide more details about organizations, activities, or ideas in the news. So it can be something related to think tanks, non-governmental organizations, different protests, and so on. How to do it features tell people how to accomplish a task. Occupation or hobby features are usually about dangerous occupations or hobbies. And behind the scene features are about the backstage work of a public event. How do we keep people engaged when writing feature stories? You need to, you will grab their attention with an attractive headline. So you need to have that catchy headline, and then you also need to have an engaging lead, an engaging first paragraph of your story. Make sure to provide crucial facts at the beginning. Keep stories simple and concise so you can go into details, but then remember, depending on the type of magazine that you write for, or an online newspaper, you really want to make sure that everybody understands what you're saying. So you can be descriptive, but also remember that everybody needs to understand your words. In writing a feature story, consider, and I'm repeating this again, starting with an anecdote, a catchy premise, the most important points, or simply you can start with the most interesting quotations. So let's take a look at this lecture about feature writing. What are features? Feature stories are human interest stories. What is it that they are comprised of? They have the lead, the body, and the end of the story. Unlike inverted pyramid stories that end with the least important information, feature stories have some form of conclusion. They are present on television, newspapers, magazines, in documentaries, and so on. They remind us of fiction writing, but there is a major difference between the two. All feature stories need to be based on facts, even though they are detailed and descriptive, and in that way they do remind us of creative writing, but we cannot make up anything. Everything in our feature story needs to be based on facts. There are different types of feature stories. There are personality features, historical, adventure, seasonal features, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, and so on. Hobby features, running, um, pottery, and so on. They also must include actions, people, and places. And again, I must emphasize this because we're in journalism. Everything in feature stories needs to be factual. And that is all that I had for you for today. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day. Bye bye.